Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance here in the room and online as well. I'm pleased to moderate today's seminar on deliberative democracy and extremism with two prominent speakers. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Selen Ercan. I'm a professor here at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and the region. Today's seminar is part of our center's spatial conversation series, 10 Big Questions, celebrating the 10th anniversary of our center here at the University of Canberra. And the seminar series is convened by Dr Adele Webb with the assistance of our research assistant, Ferdinand Sanchez. You can find and watch the recordings of the previous seminars online. And today's seminar will be recorded as well. I hope this is fine with everyone. Today, we are asking the fifth big question: how should deliberative democracy respond to extremism? We have two prominent speakers to help us develop a response to this question. Jordan McSwiney is a senior research fellow in political science at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance here at the University of Canberra. Jordan researches the far right with a focus on the organization and communication of the far right parties and movements. Our second speaker is John Gastil. John is a professor of political communication at Penn State University. He has studied political psychology and democratic innovation for 30 years, and some of the reforms he has proposed became law. John, it's an honor to have you here in person with us at the center today for this seminar. So, coming back to the big question we are asking today. We think the question about how deliberative democracy responds to extremism is an important one. Deliberative democracy is usually viewed as an approach best suited for addressing relatively straightforward disagreements among individuals who share fundamental values, not the tough ones like extremism. The fundamental question that we are interested in here at the center and more broadly is, what does deliberative democracy offer, if anything, to deal with the extremist arguments, threats, and in some cases with the extremist attacks? So I will now turn to our speakers, and I would like to ask to both of the speakers, I would like to ask you to reflect on the significance of the question we are asking today as well, like the relationship between deliberative democracy and extremism. And also, I would also like to invite you to provide your definitions of both extremism and deliberative democracy as part of your initial comments and interventions. We will start with John Gastil. He will give his response to these questions, and then we will turn to Jordan. Jordan will also provide his initial comments, and then we will take it from there for further discussion. Over to you, John. So, what does deliberative democracy offer, if anything, to deal with extremism?
So as you requested, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure. For those online, I am looking at people here in the center who are all looking back at me with stern faces, waiting for content. I will provide that now. So first, definitions, as you requested. I like to talk about democratic deliberation as a practice that has two parts because it has two words. So the deliberation part, separated from the democratic part, is the core of it is rigorous analysis. Everything from understanding the nature of a problem, strong information base, weighing different values, looking seriously at the downsides of your preferred position, things like that. And that could be done in an undemocratic way. Just the deliberation part is that analytic rigor. The democratic part is where the more normative values of inclusion, equality, mutual respect, and so on come in. And when you marry them together, you get a deliberative process that is respectful of democratic principles. I'll stop there and move over to extremism. For extremism, It's cool. I'm kind of growing a succulent plant out of my head. That's kind of awesome. I'm now going to make sure that stays there because it is the fragile fern of democracy that bursts forth from the font head of this wisdom. Extremism, I'm going to say, has two characteristics, which, by the way, I realized sort of parallels this excellent book that is now available wherever books are sold, traded, or stolen by Andre Bachtiger and John Dryzek on deliberative democracy for diabolical times. And one of the themes in their book is talking about deliberative democracy in relation to sort of two levels of analysis. What can it do for the person versus the larger entity, institutional reforms, and so on. And when I define extremism, it has a similar sort of two levels. On the one hand, we can talk about an extremist, a person who has extreme views. And when you think about a person, it's easy to think about an issue. There is something about which they have an extreme point of view. And that part of extremism, I think deliberative democracy has the easiest time with because you simply draw them in. You draw them in. And I've seen this time and again in all sorts of deliberative settings. People who have extreme views are very excited to share them. They hope to win converts, but they fall into this social process where you're listening to other people, you're hearing different arguments. Certain facts get pretty well established that may or may not be comfortable with them. And in the end, they don't necessarily change their views fundamentally, but you do sense that they now see themselves as part of a plurality of points of view, that there is a recognition they don't necessarily have all the answers. So in terms of deliberative democracy addressing extremism for the individual, I think it's relatively easy as long as your goals are modest. The goal is not to bring this person to the other side or convert them into a centrist. The goal is to essentially drain the poison a bit, make them feel a little less passionate about hating other people. And one of the most universal effects of these deliberative processes is people who participate developing more positive attitudes towards fellow citizens, right? People get a little too obsessed with changing everybody's mind. How about just changing their mind about everybody else, making them feel like, you know what, I think there's other smart people who disagree with me, and that's a huge accomplishment. And I think that addresses some of the most dangerous aspects of extremism circle around the world word dehumanization of your opponents. The second level, though, is we talk about extremism as a social movement, and somebody over here hopefully has better things to say about this. But when you think about extremism as a political party or a movement, this is more challenging, I think. Here, I think deliberation has the potential to tap into this idea of a superordinate identity as a common concept that has many names. I come a little bit from social psychology. And when we talk about a superordinate identity, it's something as simple as if I come into a group thinking of myself as distinct in every way and you do the same and everybody in the group is different, but it turns out we're all on a jury. Now we're all thinking of ourselves as members of this community from which a jury was drawn. And there's this higher identity we're appealing to, and that becomes more important to us. And we want to do things in service of that identity. So that's why you hear jurors sometimes say, I was really disappointed with the verdict we reached, and I was in it because I didn't want that. But I do recognize that as a jury, this was our job, and here's what we do as part of the state of Washington or whatever. And so I think with extremists, we notice on the far right, there's a lot of nationalistic appeals. And sometimes those are, well, they're almost always defining the nation in a way that excludes lots of groups. But I think you can appeal right back to that nation and kind of maneuver them and say, well, deliberation is very much about what the full collective thinks. And if you talk about one nation, a national pride, national identity, we get all of that, not just the part over here that was made or done or reimagined by your group, but all of us. And I think back to the Australian Citizens Parliament, and a very powerful experience for the Australians there that was a head scratcher for me until it was explained, was people kept saying, it was 150 Australians brought together in 2009. And more than one person started saying, this is the first time I've ever thought of myself as Australian. And the idea of us all being in one room, I feel like I'm looking at the whole country. People were crying. An Indigenous member of the parliament spoke and said similar sentiments. It was just a waterworks in the room. And it was explained to me later that apparently many people in Australia don't have a strong national identity. But boy, once it was activated, people just lit up and wanted to do things together. So I think at the level of a social movement or a political party, I think that's one of the things deliberative democracy offers, is a genuine, national appeal that is inclusive and pluralistic and robust, that may help pull some people out of a ditch where they kind of thought they had this powerful nationalist patriotic sentiment, but it was really missing a lot. So maybe there's more to offer from deliberative democracy in its unitary impulse towards pulling us all together. And then you discover pluralism within it, which hopefully again gets back to the idea of draining the poison a bit and making you realize, well, I'm part of something that is complex.
Yeah, great. Thank you, John. It's really great to have you here and to have this conversation with you. Responding, Selen, as you've asked, for some definitions to begin with. So when I'm talking about extremism, I am building on the work of J.M. Berger. I am thinking of extremism as the belief that an in-group success, regardless of how that's defined, that could be cultural, it could be linguistic, it could be ethnic, it could be religious, that their success or their survival as an in-group cannot be separated from the need for hostile action against an outgroup. And again, that outgroup can be defined however these are constructed. They're not, ontologically fixed, let's say. That hostile action can include violent acts, of course, and when it becomes violence and when violent action against the outgroup becomes inseparable from that in-group's success or survival, then it becomes violent extremism. Now we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about, neo-Nazi terrorist groups and so forth. But extremism can also include non-violent or non-physically violent and non-criminal actions. And so this is where I think things become a little bit murky and a bit tricky, because holding extreme views isn't and shouldn't, as far as I'm concerned, be a criminal offense. It is not a predictor for violence, holding extremist views, nor will the overwhelming majority of people who hold extremist views ever commit an act of violence. And so I think that's really important at the outset, because I think a lot of the popular discourse about extremism, we're thinking immediately violent extremism, we're thinking very carceral, very police and intelligence heavy interventions. And as untasteful, to put it lightly, as we may find some extreme views, holding the views in and of itself shouldn't be criminalized. So how then do we grapple with this? Well, in terms of thinking about deliberative democracy, I take a more, public sphere orientated approach. So I think of deliberative democracy following John Drysek's work as like a normative theory of democratic legitimacy based on the fundamental idea that those affected by collective decisions have the right capacity and opportunity to participate in consequential deliberations about those decisions. And so in that sense, I'm very concerned with the public sphere as the totality of all public conversations about matters of common interest, from pubs to parliaments, social media, whatever. And so I think this question of how should deliberative democracy respond to extremism is very important if we're concerned in the health of our public sphere, because the hostile action central to extremism, even if it's not necessarily violent and even if it's not necessarily criminal, it still has the potential to damage the democratic functioning of our public sphere, and in turn, our democracies, by changing the terms of engagement of the public sphere and by rewriting the basis for belonging and participation in it. So how can we address this? Some of the work we've been doing at the Centre for a while now, in terms of our Democratic Resilience Project, is thinking about the public sphere as this overlooked target of extremism. Because despite the fact that I think a fairly standard acknowledgement in the literatures on, say, terrorism, that it is a largely communicative act, right? That terrorism is terrorism, not because of the scale or kind of violence, but because of the message that the violence communicates or is intended to communicate. That despite that, the public sphere is like the site of harms or damages is often overlooked. We think instead about obviously deaths and injuries it's caused, damage to infrastructure, and effects on institutions, democratic integrity and things like that. All very important, of course, but the public sphere gets kind of lost in that. So I think something that deliberative democracy can bring to this in terms of thinking about how we respond to violent and non-violent extremism is, well, what role do key players in the public sphere have in terms of responding to violent extremism, and what does their response do in terms of containing or exacerbating or perhaps repairing and countering some of the harms that violent extremism and non-violent extremism is intended to create. So what does that look like in practice, right? That's a nice idea. It's a bit immaterial. Let's think about news media, for example, right? How can news media avoid the kinds of sensationalist reporting that exacerbate some of the democratic harms, that promote extremist narratives, that legitimize extremist actors inadvertently, that further the marginalization of affected communities? How can media deal with this? Well, they could start by, for example, not as the Australian has done yesterday, run a massive feature on Inside the Far Right with lots of nice photos of the neo-Nazis taken from their social media, where they are very happy with those images being circulated. Indeed, the reason they've taken those photos is because they want them out in the world. Sensitive coverage of violent extremism is possible. Media organizations just kind of have to work for it. And we can see, for example, in the aftermath of the Christchurch massacre in 2019, 51 Muslims killed by an Australian white supremacist terrorist. 5 major publications in New Zealand that do not normally like each other came together and adopted guidelines for sensitive reporting on the trial. They recognized the potential harms that sensationalist reporting would cause on affected communities in terms of legitimizing white supremacist ideology and these kinds of things. So they adopted guidelines which, to quote from the statement they all published as a simultaneous editorial, "We will not publish statements that actively champion white supremacist or terrorist ideology," end quote, while also actively avoiding publishing excerpts from his so-called manifesto, the shooter's manifesto, as well as any symbols, imagery, or gestures made by the shooter promoting his ideology out of the news. So I think that is a very concrete example of something that a public sphere actor like the news media can do. But this is dealing with violent extremism, right? That's the sort of pointy end, easy bit to be opposed to, easy bit to address, doesn't slip into criminality. It is obviously in criminality, rather. How can we respond to non-violent acts of extremism that don't actually breach any laws, right? This has been an ongoing debate in Australia, and one of the big interventions at various state levels and now federally has been to criminalise the public display of symbols and gestures related to the far right. So like the swastika, Nazi salutes and things like that. That's very well intended, but unfortunately it's a largely ineffective intervention, right? For example, Germany has banned the display of the swastika since after the war, and unfortunately Germany has not solved Nazism. They have a large and thriving neo-Nazi movement. It's also easy to circumvent, and I'm deeply troubled by the extension of essentially cops and courts into the public sphere to essentially police the circulation of symbols. I think that is fundamentally iffy. And it's also counterproductive because this becomes the focus of the state's public sphere interventions, and it lets other public sphere actors like media, like civil society organizations, like ordinary citizens on social media, like political leaders off the hook, in that this becomes the core measure for addressing it. So we're left in a somewhat tricky situation of where do we go from here? And hopefully that's probably where some of our conversation can dig into.
Great, thanks, Jordan and John. John, would you like to respond to initial comments, responses from Jordan, and ask him any questions, maybe pointing out any agreements, disagreements with his position, and then I will ask you to do the same for John's remarks.
Yeah, I'll make a brief and only tangentially serious suggestion, and then I have a question about the application of these ideas in a context that is of particular significance to someone who lives in a country currently called the United States of America. So first, the suggestion is I strongly encourage you to, at some point in a publication, use the phrase fundamentally iffy. I actually like that language because I think, we can be prone to extremism ourselves. And it's too easy to slip from normative philosophy into making a definitive empirical statement. And part of what I liked about your presentation was you're saying it seems to be working, and you're looking at actual case studies. So it's a principled approach to the problem, but one grounded in empirics. So in that spirit, my question to you is, if there's this spectrum of extremism from non-criminal, non-violent action, which is principally what we see in the United States, that then can be contrasted with the violent extremism, lurching all the way into terrorism. Do you see a country like the United States with established democratic norms, traditions, institutions that have been tested and weathered somewhat in recent years? How easily do you see it slipping from the non-criminal, non-violent action into something more extreme? Part of what's on my mind for those who follow the news is a recent Supreme Court ruling saying the president is above the law. Presumably, that could be, paired with a pardon to encourage other people to act in concert. So is that an opening for genuinely, violent transformation of our political landscape, or do you think that's many, many steps away?
Mm-hmm. It's a very, firstly, thank you. I like that you like my iffiness. It's a very important point, and one that I should really have clarified in my opening comments, in that while, of course, non-violent extremism is not criminal, and I don't think it should be, in the interests of, an open and fair public sphere, that we don't allow the state too much control over what circulates there, because I feel fundamentally iffy about that, a very technical term. But that is not to say that non-violent extremism still isn't an issue, particularly in contexts like the US, and the role of, the MAGA sort of cohort, because of course there is a very real and concrete link, if not between individuals holding an extremist belief and then that individual conducting an act of violence. There is a very real link between the legitimizing environment of a discourse of extremism and then acts of violence. There is as the Christchurch Royal Commission report essentially argues, that there is a real link even between, and I should also say, we shouldn't perhaps exceptionalize extremism, right? Because racism and white supremacy is every day in the US, as in Australia, as settler colonial societies. These are not extreme. These are the fundamental bases for our states in which we live. And so as the Christchurch Royal Commission report argues, essentially, that there is a material link between everyday political talk and everyday Islamophobia and racism and acts of horrific violence like the Christchurch massacre. Because these kinds of discourses, whether they are concretely extremist or whether it's particular media commentators writing particularly horrific things or saying particularly horrific things on their primetime broadcasts, that provides legitimation and ideological nourishment for more extreme actors. And it creates a legitimizing environment in which acts of horrific violence seem like a legitimate way forward within, the extremist milieu. Does that mean I think that the US is very suddenly going to slip into, collapse? I don't know, wait and see what the next election plays out.
That was not an encouraging
I know.
answer. Yeah, no.
I mean, look, frankly, I don't actually really know enough about American politics outside of what happens in white supremacist circles there to be able to make a confident assessment. I can't imagine the union's going to fall apart so soon, but maybe not. I mean, you're the American. And frankly, I'd ask you.
You're welcome to waste your question on that, but you only have one.
Well, but before I get to my question, then perhaps, One thing I did want to maybe talk a little bit about, because what I like in your approach, John, is the sort of two-tiered individual institutional approach. I think we're pretty well on the same page when it comes to individuals, and I think there is a lot of potential within a deliberative context to engage and perhaps help kind of bring people who may be attracted to anti-democratic extremist ideas back into the sort of political community. So I'm broadly on board with that. Although I do think setting matters. I don't think, for example, we need to have large-scale public deliberations with neo-Nazis to think what they think about non-white people, for example, right? So I think time and place and context matters. I think smaller scale private deliberations like exit conversations for violent extremists, I think, are a good example of that. But on the institutional question, and this kind of comes back to perhaps my earlier comment in response to yours, I'm also fundamentally iffy about the national as a collective identity having a positive superordinate role, particularly in a context like Australia or the US, which is where the national is, okay, yes, there's a nice story of immigration and etc. But all of that elides the brutal colonial genocide, which is the basis for it. And particularly in Australia, I think is very inseparable from that. I mean, we had the White Australia policy until the 70s. We continue to celebrate our national holiday on the day that marks the beginning of brutal British colonization of the continent. So, and as a nation, we're not willing or we're not able, for perhaps a variety of reasons, to have a measured and mature conversation about what national identity and belonging look like here, particularly with respect to Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people in the context of the voice referendum. So I do wonder perhaps what, if any, challenges there might be to the idea of using, and I don't have an alternative, by the way. I don't have a, you know, another superordinate identity perhaps that we can use instead. But I wonder what your perhaps thoughts were on that.
So two thoughts, and in what seems to be a pattern for me today, though my students would say it's a pattern every day I teach. First, an irrelevant remark, and then to the substance of what you say. The expression is often said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, those of you watching this at home or on the road or wherever you are, our laptop is literally standing on the shoulders of 4 books, one of which is Catherine McKinnon's Toward a Feminist Theory of the State. One of my first favorite books of political theory. So there we are. Thank you, Dr. McKinnon. But back to the point of the national identity. So I agree that national identities can be, in a phrase comparable to fundamentally iffy, super problematic.
Nice.
But yet there we are. And there are powerful moments of, I would almost say, kind of cultural realignment when we have these sort of proud national moments that are in their own interesting way inclusive. So in the United States, it's sometimes the Olympics, where there is someone who is different from you, but you start to identify with, and you care about their success. And back to your earlier definition, your success depends upon their success. You want them to succeed. And so, you know, there's not always this sort of Jesse Owens moment where you get to say, not only are we succeeding together across lines of difference, but in opposition to another nation that we think has it all wrong, right? And so there's a certain satisfaction there that isn't unhealthy. When you think about Russia and Putin and the situation with Ukraine, I know a lot of people in Ukraine draw tremendous pride from anyone from Ukraine succeeding in international competition in a way that is, I think, unifying in a healthy way. and even transnationally. Other people identify with Ukraine and want them to succeed. So, and I don't just mean to trivialize this just to the world of sports, but I do mean to say that is one of the contexts where the kind of magic happens. And it's partly about changing the national story. So you brought up the example of the Voice referendum here. And, you know, I, as a former campaign manager, I'm always nervous that we essentialize events based on their outcome. So this failed, so that approach fails. When sometimes elections are close. And though that wasn't a close result, remember, they went from passing to failing. So they crossed that 50% threshold, and it could have prevailed. And if it had prevailed, I think we would all be pointing to, among other things, that incredible advertisement for the Yes campaign that had, what was that? It was the historic song, a popular song. What was the song?
You're the Voice by Farnham.
Quite possibly, yes.
I'm guessing.
But I mean, I showed it to my graduate students in the US, and we were on the verge of tears and not even understanding half the context and content. But that was it. And think about how the ad was produced. It was very much in the spirit of, we are all in this together. It wasn't, you know, let's create this institution that does this one thing. Let's all take pride in a move forward. So I still think there's potential there, even when national identity has been super problematic in the past.